Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. We're going to be starting in a minute or two. We appreciate you jumping on for this webinar. All right, I think we're going to get underway. So good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are in the country. I'm Matt Josephs. I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy for LISC, and I'm really happy you could join us today. Our goal today is really to examine what's happening in the federal policy landscape, particularly for the housing and economic development programs, and really showcase how these policies and programs can support our community development work on the ground in our communities. The important thing, obviously, is that hopefully we'll be able to hear from our panelists and each other. So again, thank you all for joining. We think the discussion now is really critical. There is so much happening in the federal space that we want to kind of stay on top of, both on the tax side with new housing legislation, activities happening with the administration. So it's a great time to have these conversations. And we know the federal government is one of our most important partners in community development. So we want to know, what are the key proposals coming from Congress that can support our housing and economic needs in low-income communities? Do they align with what we really need in the communities? And if not, how can we improve this alignment? So those are the topics we hope to cover. And we're going to have two panels today. Our first panel is going to feature a conversation about the current state of play in Congress, and with a focus on both the pending tax bill and also on legislation for affordable housing, home ownership, and economic development. And then we're going to have a second panel that features community development practitioners who really understand, they can put in the context for us about how these funds are so important to their work. And then following each of the panels, we'll pause and take some questions from you all through our chat. So some virtual questions from you that hopefully the panelists can answer. So with that, let's get started. And I'm going to welcome the panelists that are going to be joining me for the first panel, which is with the congressional panelists. If Dwight and Madeline and Kurt want to pop on screen. Hi, everyone. If you want to unmute, we can test your mics real quick. Say hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Great. Thanks for joining us. And we do have Dwight as a last-minute substitution. So literally, we had to call him 2 hours ago when Greg Warren, Senator Young's tax staffer, got a little wrapped up in some things that are happening right now on the Senate side with the tax bill, and had to send his apologies. So more on that in a minute. But I would like to welcome Dwight, Kurt, and Madeline for joining our conversation. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and ask you all to briefly introduce yourself, share a little about your background, and then for Madeline and Kurt, maybe a little background about your member or the district. I know, Madeline, you represent state, but just kind of give us a little flavor. So Dwight, we'll start with you, then turn over to Kurt and Madeline.
Yeah, I'll keep mine short as the pinch hitter here today. Thanks, Matt, and pleasure to join Kurt and Madeline. I work for Porterfield, Finnegan, Sears. We represent a number of housing-related clients, including the National Association of Affordable Home Lenders, and work very closely in coalitions with LISC and others on issues like the low-income housing tax credit, the neighborhood homes tax credit, new markets, opportunity zones. And so happy to be a part of this, and had the pleasure of working in both the House and Senate for a total of 16 and a half years, including at the Senate Banking Committee. So happy to be a part of the panel today.
Thank you, Dwight. Kurt, you want to go next?
Sure. So my name's Kurt. I work for Congressman Mike Flood. Mike Flood is the subcommittee chairman of the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee on the Financial Services Committee here in the House. Importantly, the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee doesn't handle sort of the tax issues around high-tech and some of the other issues that I know a lot of people on this call will care a lot about. But anything touching the FHFA and HUD is sort of like in our bailiwick. So that's my connection. And then Congressman Flood represents Nebraska's 1st congressional district. So for anyone who is familiar with Nebraska, that's the Lincoln area and some of sort of like the exurbs around Omaha, and then some rural areas a little bit further west.
So real cross section, it sounds like, rural and urban in your. That's great.
That's exactly right. Yep.
Madeline.
Hi, nice to meet everybody, or nice to see everybody. I'm Madeline. I work for the Senate Banking Committee as Housing Policy Advisor for Ranking Member Warren. So we have similar jurisdiction over the HUD and FHA, FHFA that Kurt and the House Subcommittee do. I only cover the housing portion of the Banking Committee's jurisdiction, so not touching the banking and financial sector, fortunately for me and everybody else. And I'm coming from having worked for Senator Fetterman covering housing issues, where we worked very closely with LISC as great partners on some of the work we were doing there. And then before that, working for Senator Hassan from New Hampshire. And I'm originally from Pennsylvania, from outside of Philly. And so I've only been in the banking committee job for a little over 2 months now. So working for Senator Warren, obviously representing the state of Massachusetts, but from her committee perspective. So working with our members down dais and with the groups from a national perspective rather than just the state, the Commonwealth.
Well, I'm going to actually keep the mic on you for a second, Madeline, and then ask Kurt the same question. But we know, and the practitioners on this call will certainly talk about what they've been seeing in the housing space, what their challenges are, what their opportunities are. I'm curious, what are you hearing from constituents? Are there anything that are you hearing more of it now? It seems to me like it's becoming a bigger part of the narrative. Is that your experience as well?
Absolutely. And I'm going to talk about this from both perspectives, having come from a personal office from a state where there was a lot of energy around housing, especially in the lead up to the election, and then from the national perspective as well. I will say, hearing from constituents, I think everybody has pointed out that the cost of living concerns and the affordability concerns are really top of mind for voters and for constituents as they talk to their elected officials. But the housing crisis in particular, I think we're hearing a lot more about supply than we have historically. I think that's changed a lot in the past few years. And we're hearing it from a broader spectrum of places. So Pennsylvania, you have a pretty big state with a lot of different types of communities. And while Philly, major city, has had sort of an affordability crunch and a supply crunch for a bit now, though not to the extent that San Francisco, LA, New York have, you're starting to hear now from people in the Lehigh Valley and then out into some of the surrounding more rural counties where folks who no longer can live in the Lehigh Valley are moving out to. And even they're hearing, I'd go out and hear from folks who'd say, well, rent used to be $400 or $500 a month and it's doubled now, to over $1,000 a month. That's still not DC rents, but when you're still making minimum wage and you're still, expecting to have the cost of living of Schuylkill County, that's a real concern for people, and they're incredibly upset about that and aware and want to see solutions at the local and the state level, but increasingly at the federal level as well. I think there's an expectation that someone needs to step in and do something, and this has reached a scale that can't be managed just by their local officials. At the national level, I think that housing, if you watched the debates in the last election, housing was mentioned 20 plus times in the VP debate. That I don't think I saw some tracking of how many times it had been mentioned in any previous debates, and had not been nearly as much. So I think people came in this Congress saying that this is a priority, saying this is something that they have to deal with. And so while you have a lot of members who've been talking about this for a while, Kurt's boss has been such a great leader on housing. My current boss has been talking about it for a while, but I think it's reached the level where even members who aren't necessarily dialed in on housing as a policy priority realize that they have to give this some attention.
And Kurt, same question to you. What are you hearing from your constituents?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, let me quickly do a boring disclaimer, which is just I'm not speaking for my boss, right? This is just Kurt Wayap just talking. It'd be a lot more exciting if you were talking to Mike Flood. But in terms of the question, so I mean, we've been hearing it. We've been hearing about housing supply, like Madeline talked about, specifically a lot, and we heard a lot about it the last several years. And it's interesting because like the nature of the problem is sort of different in different areas, right? There's been a lot of, long, well sort of researched pieces from a lot of big papers about housing problems in metro areas like DC or New York City, right? But it extends way beyond that. And, one example that we highlighted at our first housing subcommittee hearing back in March that focused on housing supply was a little community in Nebraska called Columbus, Nebraska, which is like 30,000 residents. We had a representative from Columbus's city government come in and talk about their housing supply challenges. And it's really interesting because it's a smaller community. It's not sort of what you think of when you're thinking about housing supply and like huge rents or like crazy expensive homes. But what it is in Columbus is basically an economic development barrier because you have a labor market that's super tight. I think the unemployment rate's like 1%, maybe even below 1% in Columbus. And you have a lot of interest from the industry that's there in expanding their operations in Columbus. Like they have a good relationship with the local government. They, have a good plant. They have a good situation set up. And the problem is they're not able to expand because there isn't the housing stock to accommodate it. And so in order for this community to grow, it needs more housing. And so it's gotten to the point where the city of Columbus is trying to basically like use dollars to develop plots of land, like put in like the infrastructure for plots of land in the hopes that they can attract developer investment on those plots of land because Columbus is not, it's somewhat remote. It's not located extremely closely to, a big metro area. So there's costs that are associated for developers and just getting materials out there, right? And so it's interesting, like from a rural perspective, the problem looks a little bit different. But long story short, we've been hearing about this a lot.
Yeah, and I think it's such a great point you raised about this is an economic development tool as much as it is a housing tool. I'm part of a group called the Neighborhood Homes Coalition, and we're going to talk about the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. And the slogan we use is that homes are where jobs go to sleep, because it's so true. They're so well connected. The supply issue is also a great transition. First off, I do want to again thank Dwight for jumping in at the last minute for Greg Warren, who's been a fantastic staffer for Senator Young. And I want to make sure I give the credit where it's due. For Senator Young, really a Republican from Indiana, has taken the lead on the Senate side with two major pieces of legislation that are two of LISC's top priorities. One's the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which would make improvements, about 24 different improvements to expand to improve the low-income housing tax credit program. So that's the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. He's taking the lead on that bill, and also the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which would create a new tax credit for investments in single-family homes in communities where the investments, what they're supporting is that the cost to develop or rehab homes is really more than the value of the homes. So you have homes that cannot be brought to market in these communities, probably like the one you're talking about in Nebraska, where this is such a great tool. So I want to thank Senator Young for his support of that legislation. Senator Young also, I know a lot of folks on this call are community partners of LISC and receive capacity building money from HUD through the Section 4 capacity building program. Senator Young has also led that initiative for us in the Senate to make sure that that program gets fully funded. So thank you in absence to Greg and to Senator Young. And with that, Dwight, I'm going to actually turn it over to you. I want to talk about some of these tax bills, like low-income housing tax credits, neighborhood homes. But first, remind everyone, where are we? There's a major tax legislation that's moved through the House. It's currently being considered in the Senate. That has taken away a critical staff person from this call. What exactly is going on?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Really appreciate it. Yeah, so I guess the quick overview is the Senate is trying to make changes to the bill for sort of really two reasons, right? They are responding to a House-passed reconciliation bill, as it's known in Congress, because they're using budget reconciliation rules, which allows the Senate to pass it with a simple majority of 51 instead of the traditional 60 vote, given the filibuster and cloture rules in the US Senate, right? But what that means is there's a trade-off. If you're going to use the budget reconciliation process, you have to follow the budget reconciliation rules of the Senate to get to that 51 threshold instead of 60. So the changes that the Senate is contemplating to the House-passed bill of several weeks ago now fall into really two buckets, right? One bucket of changes are changes they are being required to make because of those budget reconciliation rules. And the parliamentarian of the Senate is the official referee, if you will, when it comes to determining if a provision meets the budget reconciliation rules and if it does not. And so those changes are occurring as we speak, and each side meets with the Republican and Democratic staffers from the authorizing committees and the tax committee ultimately meet with the parliamentarian to determine what passes muster and what can be in this reconciliation bill and what cannot, right? So that's part of what they're doing as we speak. They're trying to wrap that up in the next couple of days so that the Senate could vote before the end of this week or even into the weekend. And then that second bucket of changes, and you're surely hearing and reading a lot about those, are changes they want to make on policy that that Senate Republicans just happen to disagree with House Republicans on, right? So everything from the Medicaid provisions to the SALT deductions and other things. And so the changes that they want to make in the Senate are both on policy changes that will pass muster and can be part of this bill. And then there are going to be some things that they're just getting kicked out because the parliamentarian said that does not fit budget reconciliation. The goal is to have a bill passed by the Senate that the House could then also pass and get to the president for a bill signing by the July 4th holiday. And as everybody knows, that's a week from Friday. And that means there's still a lot of work to do. The other question is, are the changes that will be made in the Senate, given they have a 3-vote margin, and then go to the House, can House Republicans accept those changes, given they also only have a 3-vote margin, right? And so each Republican leader, Senator Thune in the majority leader in the Senate, and Speaker Johnson in the House, can only lose 3 votes. If they lose more than 3, it would fail because, as everybody I think knows, this is a party line exercise, and they're trying to do this with only Republican votes in the House and Senate, hence the 51-vote threshold in the Senate that they're utilizing. So that's the overview. I think quickly the goal would be for the Senate to have this vote on the floor completed, or the bill on the floor, debate and votes completed by, say, Sunday, ideally, Saturday or Sunday, and then go to the House, and then the House would get called back into session, even if they start their recess for the July 4th holiday. Both chambers are supposed to be out all next week, but I think then the House would get called back probably for a Tuesday or Wednesday vote so that you could get it to the president's desk for a Friday bill signing ceremony. So that's the goal and the plan and the potential timeline.
It sounds to me like that's quite a stretch to meet this. It seems like the plan B, right, Dwight, is like to do everything Dwight's talking about. The Senate and the House have to pre-negotiate this. And with like such few, any 2 or 3 people holding out on something is going to slow everything down because there's such slim majorities. The other option is the Senate's going to pass a bill that they can get through, and then there's going to be longer conferences that happen. That cannot happen before July 4th. That would mean now what Dwight, we're looking at maybe September or something like that for.
Well, probably then more into July for sure, right? And the August recess would become a sort of a new deadline of sorts. There's really sort of the July 4th deadline is an artificial deadline, right? A self-imposed deadline by Republican leaders and the president, who would love to have a bill signing ceremony that day. The real true deadline, as Kurt and Madeline are well aware, is actually the kind of debt limit provision that's in the bill, right? Reconciliation rules allow for an increase in the debt limit. There's a $5 trillion increase in the Senate version of the bill. There was a $4 trillion increase in the debt limit in the House bill. And that debt limit is going to be breached at some point approximately mid-August. We don't know for sure, right? The Secretary of the Treasury determines that and may come up with a new, sort of a new X date, as it's called. But right now, the best guess is sort of mid-August. And as we know, the House and Senate like to have that month is traditionally a month when they're not in session. And so sort of an end of July would become a de facto secondary deadline if they don't make the July 4th deadline. But I will say the pressure's mounting, and the sort of everybody get on board and give the president the bill signing ceremony is really sort of seems to be pushing folks to get to yes. And I think there's still a reasonable chance this is going to get done before the 4th of July, as hard as it will be.
I'm going to take that bet with you, Dwight.
All right. I know most people will say, and Kurt and Madeline know this well, most people will tell you always take the over on Congress meeting its deadlines, right? So always take the over.
And real quick, before we turn it back and talk maybe about some more authorizing other legislation out there, Dwight, where are some of the key priorities we mentioned? What's happening with the low-income housing tax credit, Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, opportunity zones, and new markets tax credits? A lot of folks are interested in those. Just real quickly,
Yeah. Real quick, I guess the big news is what the Senate did differently than the House, particularly on the low-income housing tax credit and new markets, was make them permanent. right? Historically, these tax credits have been extended for certain periods of time. Some of that has been driven by the budget rules because you have a 10-year scoring window. And so if you're within that 10-year window and you do less than 10 years, you can get a lower score. And so historically, sometimes you've had less than permanent and you've had less than 10 years on some of these tax extenders, as they're called. Making them permanent is expensive from a scoring standpoint, but that is something the Senate has done, and that's a big change compared to where we've been in the past. On LIHTC specifically, the Senate bill not only does permanent, but it provides that 12% increase in the allocation of the 9% credits, and it reduces the private activity bond financing requirements for 4% credits from 50% to 25%. So those are pretty significant changes. Opportunity zones, again, permanently authorizes them into the tax code. 10-year designations made by governors starting next year, and then every 10 years going forward. Quite a few additional changes, Matt, that we could go into in some detail there, but I'm gonna leave it there for now. New markets also made permanent, as I said, so a significant change there as well. And then the neighborhood homes tax credit, as you mentioned, which is really the one tax credit, exclusively geared towards single family home ownership and the rehabbing of homes that need that help in low income areas, right? Low census tracts that are low income, unfortunately was not included. And part of that is that's a new tax credit as opposed to the low-income housing tax credit, new markets being existing tax credits. So that's part of the challenge anytime you want to add new tax credits to these tax packages. But has a lot of bipartisan support in the House and Senate. And I know the supporters and sponsors of the neighborhood homes tax credit are going to continue to work hard to either, if it doesn't get in here at the last minute, try to find opportunities down the road for that to pass in the future.
Really appreciate it, Dwight. I know you may have to jump a few minutes earlier than the other panelists. So again, we appreciate you jumping on, but you can stay. We may have one more question for you. I want to encourage folks that are tuning in, if you want to pop some questions in the Q&A. So turning back to Kurt and Madeline, so we've been talking about a tax bill, which is done in the Finance Committee or the Ways and Means Committee in the House, but you guys are on what's known as the Authorizing Committee. Madeline's on Banking Committee, Kurt's on Financial Services. So you guys oversee HUD, housing legislation generally does come through those committees. So Kurt, starting with you, what are some of your boss's priorities? What legislation are you guys hoping that maybe you can get across the finish line?
Sure. So a few things. There are some sort of like longer standing housing bills that, my boss is very supportive of. One of those is the Housing Supply Frameworks Act, which I worked a lot with Madeline on when she was with Fetterman. And then also the YIMBY Act, which will now be named something else this Congress, but is substantively the same bill. So he's still very supportive of those bills, and we're trying to move those. The big sort of new item that we've been focused on is he's become so like he's very interested in housing supply, right? So we ended up kind of looking at all the HUD programs and trying to figure out like where do we start with this, right? Like where do we start in terms of thinking about reauthorizing programs, reforming programs, like what are productive changes we could make? And the Home Investment Partnership Program, as I'm sure a lot of the people on this call already know, is sort of the supply program, right? It's about building and rehabbing affordable housing in America. So he wanted to take on sort of a deep dive in the Home Investment Partnership Program and figure out what changes could Congress make to this statute that hasn't really been changed much since the 1990s. And really has, I haven't seen a lot of substantive home legislation in a long time. So we have been working very closely with Ranking Member Cleaver from Kansas City. And we've run a fulsome process where we had the two of them basically request feedback from different stakeholders that use home funds. LISC participated in that process. I'm sure some of the people on this call participated in that process. And then we had some meetings, had some like follow-up meetings with some of those folks that wrote in. with both my boss and Ranking Member Cleaver like at the table together, asking folks questions about how the program works in practice, what the problems are, what the blind spots are, what things could be changed by Congress. And the next step is we are going to have a hearing next month, specifically about the home program. And we're going to notice what will likely be a draft of a bill to that hearing. And, this is something where my boss wants to legislate. So we're really, really excited about, the bipartisan sort of partnership we've had with Ranking Member Cleaver. We're very excited that there's a lot of interest around housing supply on both sides of the aisle, and that particularly in the wake of the book Abundance coming out, which I know has been very popular in some circles with some folks on the left, like we think this would be a great opportunity to sort of put some of those principles into practice as they relate to housing. So we're very, very excited about sort of our home investment partnership program efforts, but there's obviously a lot more work to do as well.
So, all right, so I'm just going to remind folks, because we probably don't have time to get into the intricacies, but you said the Housing Supply Framework Act is something they could look up. The YIMBY Act, which will be reintroduced this year, but something then obviously then the home reauthorizations. And yeah, we do appreciate your open process, calling in for comments, and we are happy to proceed in that and look forward to it. Madeline, what about you all on the Senate side? What are you seeing as a potential for legislation?
Yeah.
Then let's talk about the process. Like, will there be a bipartisan markup?
Sure. So I think from my boss's personal priorities, she's introduced her bill, the American Housing and Economic Mobility Act, what we've been calling internally a HEM, which represents, her vision of what a big, thorough a way to address the housing crisis is. But she's really interested in how we can be moving forward on bipartisan legislation to address the housing crisis, understanding that the chair right now is Senator Scott. He has introduced his Road to Housing Act, or he introduced it last Congress, which is his vision of what moving forward on a robust housing package might look like. And we've been engaged in a really great process with their team on potential markup of, as you mentioned, bipartisan housing markup. The goal being, that we'd be able to come to something that both sides can agree on and that stands on the idea that we need to address housing supply. That's been a focus. Senator Scott has talked a lot about supply. And then also, address some of the concerns around homelessness, some of the concerns about affordability, and then potentially looking at some of the financing obstacles for housing as well. So that's been an ongoing process. I think you can look to a lot of the bipartisan bills that members on the Banking Committee have introduced and reintroduced this Congress. The Rural Housing Act that Senators Rounds and Smith have been working on for quite some time has a ton of support and has been really looked at. It's something that we had hoped to move last Congress, still hope to move this Congress. There's other bills that the committee has been working on. When I worked for Senator Fetterman, the Whole Home Repairs Act, Senator Lummis is pushing on the committee. There's some great legislation that's come out between Senators Smith and Rounds, Senators Reed and Rounds. Rounds is up to a lot. Senator Lummis and Reed also have a great bill on ADUs and manufactured housing financing. So I think that there's like a handful, a dozen or a dozen plus bills that have been put out that are bipartisan, as well as some, partisan bills on the Dem side that we'd support as well. So it's been an ongoing process. I think looking at building on road and then what else we can add on top of that to put out. What my boss is really interested is like saying there's a housing crisis. We have not moved on housing legislation in the Senate Banking Committee in a very long time. So all the momentum leading up to that, we'd like to have a really big payout to be able to go out and say, members go home to their constituents and say, we heard you loud and clear. This is a crisis and we're responding accordingly.
So you've actually touched on I had a little cheat sheet of a lot of the bills, and you really touched on a lot of them. The one I would say that didn't come up that I would just ask everyone to keep an eye on is CDBG disaster recovery reauthorization. I think that's another bipartisan
Yes.
way we can make a lot more efficient the use of disaster recovery money that comes through CDBG. And quickly timing, do we have no market's been scheduled yet in this?
No markup scheduled. I think we're hoping sometime this summer is the tentative goal. Like Dwight said, it's always better to bet on the over. I think we've been talking about this, and anybody who's worked with the Senate probably has flashbacks to us doing the same process last Congress and the Congress before, of shooting for a markup and not quite getting there. But just from a staff hat perspective, I'm optimistic and have been feeling really good about the energy behind this, and we'll give credit to folks on both sides of the aisles, staff on personal offices and in the committee staff, that everybody does seem to really want to get to something on this. So there's a lot of positive energy behind it. It's just devil's in the details and negotiating out something that everybody can get on board with and avoids the red lines on both sides.
All right, we're about to pivot to our second panel, but before we do, I did want to, a few questions were sent to me from the chat. One is interesting. Hey, is there a way to get all the good stuff from the bill, LIHTC, new market tax credits, without the bad stuff like cutting Medicaid and stuff? It's unfortunately it's a tough thing to do. We're so happy that some of the housing supply issues are being addressed, including the expansions to the housing credit, but that's the price of doing business in a kind of a reconciliation type bill. It's not a bipartisan legislation. So you certainly don't see everything you'd like to see in that. Now, one thing that could be interesting is, maybe I'll just flag it for, we lost our former chief of staff of the banking committee, but as I see something like neighborhood homes not picked up in the bill, one thing I kind of wonder aloud is there an opportunity, if there's a bipartisan housing bill that comes through the banking committee, that maybe on the floor of the Senate and House, you can kind of get a related type amendment, even though it comes through a different jurisdiction, like neighborhood homes. If we're doing a lot of work on a bipartisan housing solutions, neighborhood homes, I should say, is a very bipartisan bill, even though it didn't get picked up in the tax bill. So that's something to think about. Maybe there is another way to get some of this stuff done outside of the bill.
And can I say, one of my just congressional nerd pet peeves is that committee jurisdiction so often gets in the way of good legislating. On the Senate, you get a single referral, but on the House, you can get multiple committee referrals, and often that is what gums up the process. Or you get more cooks in the kitchen, you get more people who can raise concerns or put a brake on a process. So long term, I think we should just rethink committee jurisdictions. That's fully a staff take. That is not the opinion of my boss.
All right, excellent. Then real quickly too, well, there's a clarification question. The LIHTC provisions Dwight talked about, where they would increase the allocations by 12%. Those are in both and where they would lower the bond thresholds, is in both the House and the Senate bill. The House, what they do is they actually increase it by 12.5%, but only for 4 years. The Senate increased it by 12% indefinitely, permanently. Same with the provision lowering the bond threshold from 50 to 25%, is be a 4-year fix in the House, permanent in the Senate. The House actually had an additional provision that would allow additional credits to be utilized for rural and native housing that wasn't picked up in the Senate. So there are some subtle differences between the two, but both of them certainly do focus on LIHTC improvements. And lastly, someone asked a question about the status of CDFIs. I would say the CDFI jurisdiction does come through both the banking committee. I know Madeline said, you don't necessarily focus on the banking side, and Kurt as well, that comes through the Financial Services Committee. I would just say that this is a space we really need to watch right now. There are pending applications for funding from CDFIs throughout the country, and it's not clear that Treasury intends to move forward with funding these applications. Secretary Bessent got a question at a hearing last week, and we're still waiting to hear the response because there are some concerns. And frankly, these are broader concerns about how the administration may be treating appropriated dollars from 2025 if they're trying to maybe not disperse all of them and turn them back in through a rescission type process. That I won't get into the mechanics of that here, but that is something I think people should watch very carefully, not just at the CDFIs, but also at the agencies at HUD, et cetera. So with that, we're already a couple minutes over from our first panel. I just want to thank the congressional staffers again for joining. I'd welcome you to stick around and listen to the rest of the conversation. If you want to go off video and just listen in for a little. I see Ruth popping up. I'm going to hand off to Ruth, who's going to moderate the next panel, although she may have in trying to, oh, there you are, Ruth. I thought you may have fallen off. So I'm going to go dark myself. So thank you all. And Ruth, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you to our congressional staff panel for such a meaningful dialogue to really establish a firm foundation for this next panel discussion. I am Ruth Jones Nichols, Executive Vice President for Local and National Programs at LISC, and I am honored to moderate the discussion with our esteemed panel of leaders and community development practitioners. We heard from the first panel that there are opportunities and challenges to ensuring the viability of federal resources to advance community development. And as these legislative issues are debated in Congress, it is important for us to examine how the federal government programs support our work individually and collectively on the ground. So this second panel of community development practitioners understands how federal resources can fuel local organizations so they can provide innovative services to families and communities. So I'd love for you to join me in welcoming Michelle Delausse, Executive Director of Fifth Avenue Committee, Marcia Erickson, CEO of Grow South Dakota, and Joy Harak Brown, President and CEO of New Hope Housing. We're going to jump right into our panel because we have a really robust discussion hopefully planned, and then we want to leave some time for Q&A. So I'd like to begin by asking our panel to briefly introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about your organizations, and share with us your biggest takeaway from the congressional panel. And Michelle, I'd love to start with you.
Thanks so much, Ruth. So happy to be here. I'm Michelle Delausse, Executive Director of the Fifth Avenue Committee. We're a 47-year-old nonprofit comprehensive community development corporation based in Brooklyn, New York, serving all 5 boroughs of the city of New York. One of the things that we do is build and manage affordable housing in addition to many, many other things, including assist folks with benefit access and eviction prevention work. In terms of some of the takeaway, I've become accustomed to hearing a lot of bad news lately. And so, hearing that something that we've been advocating for so long as it relates to LIHTC, in terms of lowering the threshold from to 50% to 25% on the threshold tests, and of course, increasing allocation and talking about that being permanent rather than every couple of years having to revisit it. That's very, very significant for us in New York State alone. That would be about 120,000 additional units of affordable housing over the next few years. And considering LIHTC has, created, it'd be almost a doubling of, or 50% increase, I should say, 50% increase in what has been created in New York State. So it's significant. Pass it on.
Thank you, Michelle. Joy?
Thank you so much. And I am a CEO of New Hope Housing, and we are based in Houston, Texas. We are a developer and operator and a service provider for supportive housing, and indeed are the leading supplier of supportive housing in the state of Texas. All of our housing is deeply affordable, 60% AMI and below, and much of it is specifically intended for the formerly unhoused, including the chronic homeless, though that's not entirely our area of work. We do work with working families, individuals, and seniors as well. And as I said, we quite target supportive services so that we even have several tuition-free preschools in our developments. And I was especially interested, and certainly I've been following the LIHTC changes and the bond changes with great interest, because we use all of those programs, as anyone does who develops affordable housing, you essentially can't do it without it unless it's just a one-off every now and then. And I'm quite excited about the increase in LIHTC, though I do know that that will push the price of credits down a bit. So nothing's ever quite perfect. I was also very pleased to hear that there's some bipartisan work being done with the home program, because that's a critical program for closing gaps as those funds flow from the federal government to the states and cities, and then to developers such as ourselves. So I also heard that much is uncertain, and we've been dealing with that a great deal lately, as we all have. But there's a positive movement. I feel good about it.
Thank you, Joy. Marcia?
Hi, I'm Marcia Erickson. I am the CEO at Grow South Dakota. We're a nonprofit organization. We do serve the state of South Dakota. We provide community, housing, and economic development, and the majority of our service area is a rural area. Our primary services are business and home lending, and we couple that with development services to make sure that our borrowers are taken care of. We also provide a variety, like Michelle said, a variety of other services, including digital literacy, homebuyer education, etc. We have been a member of Rural LISC since its inception. We have 2 community development financial institutions underneath our organizational umbrella. We are also have a community action program underneath our umbrella. We have 3 nonprofits that are legally separate that we administer, and have programs for each of them underneath the 3 entities that we have. We're also a certified HUD housing counseling entity and a member of NeighborWorks America. So takeaways, similar to what Kurt had said, our rural areas need housing, not only housing for those that are there, but for the economic development possibilities that exist. But the costs are extremely high. So we're dealing with those challenges. Some of the other things that were noted, I really appreciate the work being done on the home program, the Rural Housing Services Reform Act. That is good. That is a great bill, and I'm glad that we have support for that. CDFI continues to be a concern for us. We watch it, and we are hoping for the best there. And I really think that the neighborhood homes tax credit has a lot of potential to address the challenges that we're seeing, the shortage of single-family homes that are across the U.S. and the need for home improvements. This initiative really has potential to fill a lot of our gaps that we need. So I hope that that one gets passed also. Thank you.
Thank you. And, you all touched on really some of the key changes to housing related legislation in your takeaways. And so I want to stay there for a moment if we can, because it is well recognized, and certainly it was referenced earlier in the congressional staff panel, that we are still experiencing an affordable housing crisis across the country. And there are a number of challenges and opportunities when it comes to making sure we increase the availability of housing that is affordable for individuals or households at all income levels, including those who are from low and very low income households. I wonder, though, if you can talk a little bit more about some of the challenges you're seeing for both the development of multifamily rental housing and even home ownership housing opportunities. You've touched a bit on the federal resources that are important to the work, but feel free to even elaborate on that and the specific legislation that you feel will most support your efforts. So Marcia, I want to stick with you, but then have everyone weigh in on this question if you feel compelled to do so.
Sure. Thank you. Well, in all the communities that I visit across the state of South Dakota, there's the housing needs that are priority when you walk into a community and you start having the discussions. And that's whether it's new multifamily, single family, senior housing, home improvement, etc. There is so much need. And so we need to build more housing, and we need to improve the housing stock that we have. However, there's a shortage of developers. The cost of construction is increasingly significantly higher. There's a shortage of the materials, which, increases the prices even more, labor shortages, recent tariffs, all of it. And that also creates an appraisal gap. The cost of construction is higher than the value of the property, and it's just simply not affordable. And as the mortgage rates remain high, that pushes those monthly payments up even higher for those potential buyers, along with the rising cost of construction. Along with that, in our rural market, we lack comparable sales, which creates further challenges for the borrowers to obtain a mortgage. Some of our federal resources that are important to address the housing work in South Dakota are the CDFI fund, which is under scrutiny right now. So we're hoping that that gets moved in the right direction. Rural LISC Section 4, that's one of our primary pieces that holds the glue together so that we can deliver our programs and services in housing. Weatherization is important for our families. They need safe and home efficiency measures installed on their housing. So all of those are really, really important to the work that we do. So it's great to see legislation changing, like the home program and the Neighborhood Home Investment Act, to help meet the demand and to make changes that will be better for all of us in our neighborhoods and within our communities.
Thank you, Marcia. Joy, did you want to jump in?
Well, there are a number of things that we're watching closely, and one of them certainly would be any funds that flow through the continuum of care that works with the homeless and also housing opportunities for people with AIDS. And in the big, beautiful bill, those two funding streams are collapsed, but there is no funding shown for them. And certainly through a continuum of care, there are services that come into our properties that deal with the formerly unhoused, that work with the formerly unhoused, and they offer both rental supports and services. And one of the things we don't want to see in this country, I don't think anyone wants to see, is an increase in homelessness, and certainly not for people who are currently housed to become unhoused. So we're watching that very carefully to see what happens as that begins to move through the process. We also had a couple of hits that have been distressing and distracting. And one of them was that we had a federally qualified health clinic coming into one of our properties. We already have a property with one clinic, and we were going to have a second one, and we had a gleam in our eye about a third one. And those funds, those applications were frozen. And it's not so much the cost to build out the clinic, that can be handled in other ways. It's the ongoing operations of the clinic. So healthcare for an already vulnerable population is again something we have our eye on. We also have some funds tied up in the GGRF lawsuit that Climate United filed when the greenhouse gas reduction funds were frozen. And these were funds, as I think most people on the call are aware, had already left the federal government and are sitting at Citibank. And that lawsuit involves LISC and Enterprise, Habitat, the United Way, and America Rewired, or Rewiring America. I'm not sure I have that right. It's not an organization I'm familiar with, but we were 6 weeks from breaking ground on a development, and suddenly $8.8 million was frozen. And 6 weeks away from breaking ground, we had made a very considerable financial investment already. And we have already purchased the land now. We borrowed the money at 0% from the city of Houston to buy the land, to work to put that development again together in another way, and also in the hope that those funds, that lawsuit will be resolved. And I know LISC, I'm sure, knows more about this than Joy does. And it was through National Equity Fund, LISC's nonprofit or partner, your syndicator partner, partner that we were going to receive those funds. So, we have seen up close and personal, not once, but twice. And I know that these are stories that are replicated around the country. So we have appendages crossed, and we're hoping for the best. And when I began to hear that there was bipartisan work for housing, I thought, oh, good, let's keep that up.
Absolutely. And Joy, you've started to really talk about some of the challenges we are experiencing in the community development field because of the economic conditions facing our country and the disruptions in federal funding streams. And so I wonder, Michelle, if I can pivot to you and have you share any examples of how your organization is realigning your work in light of some of these issues. Again, Joy started to talk about what they are doing, but is there anything you might add to that just from a practitioner perspective to help our audience who has joined us today?
Yeah, first off, I just want to say, Joy, I feel your pain that's that many weeks close to a closing to lose that much money. That's pretty devastating. And I'll just say that I think like the amount of money we're talking about being at risk for our communities is not something that can be made up easily, right? This is very, very significant funding. We have a much smaller example for Fifth Avenue Committee with our COC contract for our supportive housing project, where just as we were about to renew the contract, or this, I should say the city of New York was about to renew the contract, which is about $54 million. New language was inserted about, following President Trump's directives, which was objectionable to folks in New York City. And so New York City joined another national organization of cities and counties to sue the administration related to that. And so that creates uncertainty about access to those funds, which of course then, puts housing, desperately needed housing for folks at risk. In terms of realignment, I mean, I think like everybody else, we're doing the scenario planning. We're looking at all the different potential sources of earned income that we have. Are there things that we can accelerate? We're looking at, are there ways that we can rely less on some of the government subsidy dollars and still reach some level of affordability to try to address the housing crisis that exists through, as of right, tax abatement programs that the city of New York has and things like that. None of this is easy though, like to reach the most needy folks, and you do need the additional subsidy. And honestly, that is where the biggest need is. Obviously, we do need to increase housing supply across the country, but that alone is, the market is not going to solve for the lowest income people in this country. That really is the role, I believe, of government. And if government backs off from that, then we're all going to be in trouble. All of our communities are going to be in trouble. So, but for us, we're looking at, our earned income potential across the board and seeing how we can, bring in those flexible dollars and serve a range of incomes, not just the lowest incomes.
Thank you for that, Michelle. And, you touched on, I think, another really important question for most of the folks who have joined us today, which is about access to public resources. And we know that there are a number of onerous compliance requirements that come with public resources, but we also know that access to public resources will remain important to our organizations and the communities we serve. And so I wonder if everyone can give some thought to what opportunities you see to streamline federal funding to really lessen the burden on the sector. And maybe, Michelle, I'll stay with you because you started to touch on that just a little bit.
I wish there were a silver bullet in this area. I just think about the number of times, for all of us that have low-income housing tax credit projects, we know the annual recertification process, how painful that can be with the tenants and the need to do that, not just the initial 15-year period, but over time in the extended period. And, all of those costs just get passed on in some way, right? And I don't think people, as we're thinking about compliance, I don't think people are thinking about what that means for the long term and how that means there are less resources available to actually solve our housing crisis. So I would just look at some of those, you know, those low hanging fruit kinds of things like, do we really need to do this on an annual basis? How many people are no longer actually eligible over time? You know, like what is really at risk here, and how much staff time are and quite honestly, the tenants' time are we wasting by requiring people to jump through these hoops every year? So that's my little pet peeve. One thing.
Thank you for sharing that perspective. Marcia, is there anything you would add to that?
Yeah, there's a lot of the federal programming that could be changed, modified to enhance everybody, including those that we serve, like Michelle said, at the end of the day, who we want to serve. It ends up impacting them negatively because it does cost us more to deliver these programs. So some of the things that I'll point to, the capital magnet fund under the CDFI, when it's used for down payment assistance program, if there could be a change in the reporting, for example, if we've deployed 200 loans in a year and only 15 of those were repaid in a year, rather than have to clone each of those 200 loans, if we could just report on the units that have been repaid, 15 versus 200, it would save us a lot of time, a lot of administrative time. And at the end of the day, we can help more people, right? Also, if we wouldn't have to replace those loans with another similar loan, that would be hugely beneficial. And then one other thing on the Capital Magnet Fund would be to consider the revised 2024 rules that they put in place for the Capital Magnet Fund to be retroactive back to the grants in 2016. That would be very helpful for us and not just impact those 2024 going forward. Obviously, they saw this was a good deal. Let's make these changes. If we can only make them retroactive, that would be very helpful.
Excellent. And we have a number of stakeholders who have joined us today, I think, ready to advocate for some of the things that you all have shared. Before we round out that question, I want to see Joy, if you would like to weigh in. Joy, if you're interested in weighing in, I think we can hear you. Would you like to weigh in on that question?
Well, I actually can weigh in only to say me too,
Okay.
because I agree entirely. And any regulations that could be trimmed along these lines that are onerous and that just really don't appear to have much efficacy, much positive value. I think someone taking a scalpel to those, not a sledgehammer, because I know anytime you're passing out what's essentially free money, there's always the thought that people will take advantage. I'm not advocating for that, but absolutely I agree with Marcia and Michelle. There's a lot that could be done.
Fantastic. Said like a true practitioner. We're going to have one final question, and this will be for everyone before we open the floor for some Q&A. We've talked about a number of federal resources that are available to organizations, and some of the resources you have utilized in your organizations. I wonder which ones you would single out as the most critical to supporting your work, and what you believe would happen if these resources were significantly scaled back or eliminated. So that's a question for everyone. And Joy, I'll start with you in terms of the response.
Well, there's no question that the tax credit program is the most significant one for us. And really, the development of affordable housing is essentially impossible without it. And I know there is some sentiment, and I don't disagree with it, that it's a pretty expensive program. So for every dollar in federal funding that is lost, tax dollar, because of the credit, I would receive maybe 85 cents in today's market for that. And I see that spread and how that might be criticized with some. And I also know all of the regulations that drive costs up 10, 15% through the program. So the improvement of the program Well, fine. I would be really interested in ideas as to how that might happen. But the program simply disappearing would stop the construction of affordable housing in this country.
Well, thank you so much, Joy. Michelle.
I would, besides LIHTC, and home, I would just say Section 8. I mean, rent burden is going up across the country, just housing cost burden, even for homeowners, is going up across the country. And with only 1 in 4 people who are eligible for Section 8 receiving it, there's a direct line between those who have access to rental subsidy, housing cost burden, and then homelessness. And so I think we need to really, protect Section 8 and think about how to expand it.
Do you know, I really agree with that. In Houston, 1/4 of the population, 1 out of every 4 people is rent burdened, paying more than 30% of their income in rent. And I think about that when I drive down the freeway. Every 4th automobile has a rent burdened Houstonian in it. And most of those Houstonians don't have any rental subsidy. That program is critical.
Indeed. So we've heard about tax credits. We've heard about Section 8. Marcia, what would you offer as an additional thought?
Yeah, I have a long list, but I'll keep it down to NeighborWorks America and Section 4 for us. Those truly are the glue that kind of holds us together. It's can be first in capital, last out. It helps us build our capacity. It helps us meet the needs. If they were significantly scaled back or eliminated, it would severely reduce our ability to continue to offer our affordable financing products. We'd look different. We'd still be around, but we'd definitely look a lot different, and a lot less people would be served at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And so these are resources that we would like to see remain in place and certainly scaled to the extent possible. We have a couple more minutes, and there is a question in the chat that came in from an audience participant. It is, what advice do you have for nonprofits who are struggling to meet the needs of their communities? It's a general question, but given that you are leaders and practitioners in the field, what advice would you offer to other leaders and practitioners who are struggling with some of the economic conditions and disruptions to the work that we're doing?
Well,
Go ahead.
okay, I'll go ahead, Joy, and then you can jump in. But one thing that really works for us is when we engage a variety of groups, whether it's local, state, national level. Those partnerships are really important, and they can lead to innovation and new sources of funding. So engage with those different groups, find out what drives them, find out what's good, and a lot of times you can replicate their models.
And I was going to say really exactly the same thing in a slightly different way, and that is pick up the phone and call people you know or don't know and tell them who you are and what you're trying to do and what roadblocks you're facing and ask them if they could help.
Great advice. Thank
Yeah.
you.
And I would just say the coalition work is really critical, but I also think helping the people that you're serving understand why they're struggling and connect the dots for them, or help them connect the dots about their struggles and the larger context about what's going on and how public policy decisions or indecisions are actually impacting their lives. Like, don't hold on to that as the person serving them or the organization serving them, but connect them, I think, to larger movements to address their needs, because that's very empowering for that individual in those communities. And that's ultimately where the change is going to happen.
Great advice. So we heard, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can actually network with others to find out what's working well in their communities and what can potentially be replicated and scaled in your community. Pick up the phone, call people you know, and in some cases, people you don't know, but then also engage the people you are serving because they can help to co-create solutions, particularly when they understand the systems within which they are operating and experiencing a number of different circumstances. Thank you for that really great advice. Another audience question is, do you have tips for advocates to further their engagement with congressional offices? For example, can you cite examples of taking members of Congress or their staff on site visits, tours, groundbreakings, etc.? And how has that benefited your community and helped with your advocacy efforts? So I think the key question is, what are some tips for further engaging congressional offices?
I mean, I'm happy to share a couple of things. I mean, it just so happens that our office is not like it's few blocks from Senator Schumer's home. So, when we were doing organizing against a private equity investor that was buying up a bunch of rent stabilized properties and displacing people, we were sure to invite him and ensure that those tenant leaders also were able to go to DC and testify about the experience of like the impact of private equity investment in multifamily properties. And like, connecting whatever you're experiencing in the community also with their legislative priorities is often very, very helpful. So they can kind of like use the experience of whatever's going on in their district or the state to highlight how it connects to the legislative priorities. Like, so definitely invite people for tours, for speaking at rallies. It's always good.
Always a good thing. Marcia?
Yes, I totally agree with you, Michelle. Build those relationships before you need to reach out to them because then they know who you are. When I was a young professional, I was like, does this make a difference? Yes, it does make a difference. Get to know your people on the Hill and your local staffers because they're the ones that'll go to bat for you when you need something and if it aligns with their missions and what they're hoping to bring forward too. One area that has really benefited our organization that our senators and Congressman Johnson have supported is promoting rural target market for the CDFI fund. They have, helped us in many ways to say, this is good for South Dakota and for rural America, and it's been great to have their support in that area.
Thank you, Marcia. And Joy, is there anything you would add to that before we close out?
No, I think Marcia is right on target, as is Michelle. And we do also reach out every time there's a vote happening, something that can positively impact the work that we're doing. We have staff members who pick up the phone and call those representatives, call the senators, call the Congress people, whether it's, and we do that on a state and a local level as well. Those phone calls make a difference. And it also makes a difference because the staff members answering that phone call from you again and again know then that you are an engaged and interested constituent. And that makes you someone to pay some attention to, quite frankly.
Absolutely. And it makes you a trusted partner and someone they can depend on. So I want to thank all of you, Joy, Marcia, Michelle, for your leadership in this sector and for your participation on today's practitioner panel. Thank you as well to everyone who stayed around to hear from these esteemed leaders. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Matt for closing remarks.
And thank you, Ruth, and to these panelists as well for a great conversation. Yeah, I just want to real quick wrap up and maybe offer a commercial too. So we covered a lot of different programs. We referenced the things in the tax code. We referenced appropriated programs as well. I want to remind folks that LISC actually has a set of policy priorities that we put out last month. We update these every 2 years to coincide with the seating of a new Congress. So I would really encourage folks, Jocelyn, maybe you can pop that into the chat and folks can read a little more about some of these priorities we've been talking about. And the other thing I really want to, I think, bridge the conversations and listening to the practitioners talk about these appropriated programs, like whether it's a NeighborWorks program or Section 4 or home dollars, how critical these are to their operations. You know, we're always kind of like on the policy support side, the advocacy lobbyists are always geared toward making sure those funding levels are as high as possible in future years, and in this case for FY26. But we have a challenge now I've never seen before, and I don't think anyone has, where it looks like the administration is trying to withhold previously appropriated dollars, which is called impoundment. And that's a really untested theory, and we're seeing that maybe NOFAs that were supposed to go out have not gone out. There's a real risk they may not go out. And so that's another challenge I think folks really need to pay attention to right now. I heard you guys talking about the Section 8 program, for example. Well, and I think you were referencing tenant-based vouchers, that there's not enough to go around. But the project-based rental assistance program also depends on private owners being able to rely on these federal subsidies. So if these are slowed down, if they're not delivered, it's going to cause havoc throughout our housing ecosystem. So I would just encourage folks to really watch this space closely as well. It's not just about future funding streams, but even the current streams that might be in danger. So that's me ending on an up note for everybody. I do want to thank everyone so much for this conversation. I thought it was really beneficial. We did record it. We're sorry for the technical difficulties at the beginning, but if you want to watch the pre-recorded address from our CEO, it's worthwhile. And we will send out an email to everybody with closing thoughts, with links to our policy priorities and to the recorded portion of the webinar if you want to share that too, so other folks can view it. So with that, I want to thank all of our panelists and all of the folks watching for your time and attention. Thanks so much.